Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Emily Levine, and I'm the Program Associate with the network, and I'm excited to welcome you to today's training on one-shot deals. Today's training is one of the network's net workshops, a series of workshops we'll be holding over the next months that will consist of online virtual learning opportunities for network members focused on various topics to learn from our peers, providers, and government partners on different subject matters. Today, we have partnered with Jack Newton, Director of Public Benefits and LGBTQ Advocacy at Legal Services of New York, commonly known as LSNY. Jack will walk us through emergency assistance grants, widely referred to as one-shot deals. This workshop will discuss eligibility for one-shot deals, including strategies on how to get applications approved, review of the different foundations of public benefits advocacy, and apply what we've learned to real-life scenarios. Before we jump in, a few housekeeping items. Jack kindly provided us with a copy of the slides from his presentation, and we will post the link to the slides in the chat. Please feel free to pull them up and follow along with Jack's presentation. Jack will present, and then we'll open it up for participant Q&A. Please type your questions in the Q&A box at any time, and Jack will answer as many as possible during the Q&A segment. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jack.
Hi, everybody. Nice to, well, I guess I can't see you, but I know you're there. These Zoom webinars are always a little like staring into an abyss. So I hope you will all follow along with me. You can absolutely hold your questions till the end. I also would be extremely delighted to have your questions during the presentation. For my purposes, please don't feel like you have to wait until the end in order to ask me questions. In all honesty, if I just read this training to you, we'll be done pretty quickly because it's one-shot deals are deceptively easy to explain, but extremely difficult to get, as I suspect almost everybody here knows. So the more questions I get, the better it is for learning and for applying, because one-shot deals are a tricky subject matter. So again, my name is Jack Newton. My pronouns are he, him, and I work at Bronx Legal Services. Am an attorney, or so they tell me. So, I mean, this is Supportive Housing Network. So this is a group that is keenly familiar with abbreviations, acronyms, initialisms, and all that mishigas. But I am including our own word salad here. I will do my best to not speak in code and to uncode it, but in the very likely possibility that I slip back into code, I have included some of the most frequently used ones here in the word salad. I'll draw your attention to just a couple of them for today. One is HRA, as I'm sure 99.99% of people know. The Human Resources Administration is the part of New York City's Department of Social Services that handles a variety of different welfare benefits in the city. And I'll draw your attention to cash public assistance, or CA. I tend to prefer calling cash public assistance cash assistance rather than just PA, because when people say they get PA, they may mean SNAP or food stamp benefits and not necessarily cash assistance benefits, which is a distinction that's something important for a variety of different things, including for one-shot deals, which we'll talk about. And I think the rest will sort of explain as we get along to them. So what has become confusing to people who have been doing this a minute, including myself? I was just marveling at my own gray hairs while I was waiting for this presentation to start, because I'm in the natural light. The gray is real indeed. But New York City's Human Resources Administration and Department of Homeless Services combined sort of under one umbrella agency called the New York City Department of Social Services. This happened in 2018. So technically HRA and DHS are part of one agency, which is the New York City Department of Social Services. But as you must know from doing this work, the fault line very much so exists still between DHS and HRA. So I'm really just referring to HRA today, even though technically they're all part of the same agency. And most advocates in the agency itself really refers to itself as these two different agencies with. So I'm hoping today people learn a general framework to work with your clients to create a plan to pay the rental arrears, and then sort of unravel the mystery that is one-shot deals. As you'll learn or be reminded of, we call something a one-shot deal when it's actually a bundle of different things underneath that sort of umbrella term that we use. So emergency assistance grants are the technical name for what a one-shot deal is usually. It's called an emergency grant because it's supposed to be for an emergency. And the emergencies are listed in different regulations and statutes, and they include forestalling or stopping an eviction, but it also includes things like utility shutoff, which I'm sure people are familiar with, and it includes stopping a foreclosure, and there's if there's been a flood, catastrophe, fire, those would also be counted as an emergency to qualify under an emergency assistance grants. But for the purposes today, we're really just going to be talking about rent arrears. Does anyone know why it's called a one-shot deal? Let chat fill them up. They also call them single issue payments. That's true. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Yes. You get it once. That's right. Once per year. I love that. That's you can actually get them more frequently, but initially it's a one-time payment. They really, if anyone has been doing this a minute, particularly under a mayor whose name rhymes with Shmuliani, you really got one-shot deal, and that was it. I mean, they held tight to that. Would make you wait 4 or 5 years until you would get your next one, etc. So there are some statutory and regulatory limitations on the number of one-shot deals you can get. However, as we'll talk about, there's something called an exception to policy kind of grant, which really isn't limited into the number. So there's no hard rule that says you can only get it one time, but different administrations are a different amount of flexibility on when or if to grant a one-shot deal. But it is a one-time grant to stop or prevent an emergency. And again, we're talking today about preventing evictions, but just keep in mind that there are other things that can be used. I saw someone ask about the pots and pans grant. I don't know who that was, but you're a person after my heart. So that's an old-timey grant. Back in the day, you would get this thing called a pots and pans grant. And there still is something sort of like it, but it's really only when establishing a new home and not just generally available. And the establishment of a new home usually can't be because of homelessness. It's supposed to be due to flood, catastrophe, fire, etc. So some of those things really are narrowly defined. So why don't we talk about a few things that are sort of the general guidelines for all kinds of emergency assistance grants. So just for your own excitement and for the law nerds out there, the sources of law, if you really want to freak out HRA, cite a regulation or law, then they suddenly get very panicked about your email or your fax, and they think, oh my God, they've cited something. But they can be extremely helpful, and all of these are Googleable. You don't need to have gone through 3 years of law school. In fact, it can be somewhat of a hindrance in figuring out all the different things that need to connect in order for these things to happen. But this is just a fairly comprehensive list of things that you might want to refer to. And there's two things that are since COVID that may be helpful that I've included here. We'll also reference it later on, but just so you know, these are two different things. It's called a GIS, a General Information Systems, which is a stupid name for a stupid thing that the state government does. So the state agency in charge of welfare in New York State is the Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance, or OTDA. And OTDA is in charge of New York City HRA, but they hate each other. But even so, they're in charge of it. And OTDA sent out these two general information system blasts that relate to mostly CARES Act, but it explains these different things, which again we'll cover when they come into context. So while I will be hammering home how there's different kinds of one-shot deals, there are, at their very essence, many different rules that cut across them. And for reasons that I'll explain in a little bit, you essentially always have to prove all of these because that's just how it works in the end. And you will get a copy of the PowerPoint in the end. I think it's already been distributed. So you almost always need to prove future affordability. An old friend, I'm sure, to so many here today, futurability is what it sounds like. You need to demonstrate to HRA that you have the future ability to cover your rent going forward, and you just had an emergency that needs to pay for it. For people in supportive housing, as you know, generally the rent is supposed to be already built in and affordable, so this isn't necessarily a hurdle. But HRA, in particular, the unit that handles one-shot deals, which is the Rental Assistance Unit, or RAU, doesn't understand supportive housing all that well. So they may not understand how the rent is set in a supportive housing setting, and you may have to remind them frequently. But futurability is difficult now more than ever with the pandemic and the massive unemployment. You will almost always, if not always, I tried to make the slides fillable, but the document just do it. You will almost always have the applicant will almost always have to provide a reason for the arrears. For some reason, people just aren't prepared necessarily to explain this. And an HRA, if you explain something that ends up being not entirely true, to them, that makes you a liar now and forever. That client has lied, they're dirty liars, when in most cases, people aren't actually lying, they're just doing their best to answer questions in a very difficult time. But you will have to provide a reason for the arrears. And whenever possible, frame the reason as being an unforeseeable and an uncontrollable reason, meaning that it could not be foreseen and it was out of that person's control. I'll give an example in a minute. You also have to show that the household had no sanctions on their cash public assistance case during the period of the arrears. And if you're currently in sanction status, they will not give you a one-shot deal. A sanction is typically when HRA claims you have not complied with their work requirement activities and therefore puts a sanction or reduction or closure on your case for your failure to comply with their rules. Complying with the rules also requires you to prove that you're exempt from the rules, which is always extra twisted, that you can be sanctioned for not having proven that you're not capable of working due to a disability, which is totally nuts, I realize, but that is the way the law is working. Right now, the work programs are suspended due to COVID, but at one point, Lord knows, they will come crashing back in. One of the crueler rules is that an emergency assistance grant is a grant of the last resort. So while some people, if you have a cash assistance case and you're under the age of 60, you can have $2,000 in a savings account, which is still a terrible amount of money and traps people in poverty and is a vestige of systemic racism and exclusion, Lord knows. However, you could have $2,000 in your cash assistance accounts and still be eligible for cash assistance. However, that doesn't mean that if you apply for a one-shot deal, you're going to keep that $2,000. The first thing HRA is going to say is, well, you have to pay that $2,000. And you'll say, what? But that's my savings account. And they say, that's right. You're eligible for cash, but that doesn't mean we can't require you to exhaust all of your liquid resources. And they absolutely will do that. Fortunately, there's one tiny bright spot, which is the stimulus payments from the Federal CARES Act had those stimulus payments, which are through, which is really a tax stimulus payment. So you submit your return and you would get up to $1,200 for the individual and up to $500 per eligible child. That amount is excluded as counting as a liquid resource in the month that you get it and for 2 months afterwards. So for people who got those stimulus payments a couple of months ago, many of whom got them in June, you've now had it for 3 months. So if you still have any pennies left from that, HRA make you pay it over as part of a one-shot deal. So that can be helpful in determining when and how people should ask for a one-shot deal. If you're working, I know it's sort of strange, right? Because many of you are the landlord in a weird way, but I think it's a good idea to tell your client, we can apply December 1. Why don't you use this month to spend down whatever it is you got from the stimulus? Maybe you could use it to buy, new nebulizer attachments or something, right? You could spend it on something so that you don't have to just throw it at a one-shot deal. And invariably, you will need to provide the current month's rent or share of rent and every additional month after you apply. So I generally don't apply for a one-shot deal on the end of it because now I've trapped my client into paying 2 months worth of rent, right? Whereas if I just applied in December, I would only have to prove that my client has December rent, right? And hopefully the one-shot deal would be approved within that time period. Otherwise, you have to keep bringing in that money during the time period. So futurability is a hideous little concept that can sometimes become quite confusing. But again, the stated principle is that HRA doesn't want to pay any rent arrears if the client's just going to be evicted 2 months from now. It's an economic rule for them. Why am I going to give you $10,000 if 2 months from now you're going to be evicted anyway? I might as well have spent that on putting you in shelter or something else, right? Like it's just doesn't make sense to them. So you have to prove that you have enough money to cover your rent and sort of necessities. Now, you can use the ever elusive third-party guarantor, which I'm sure is well known to this team, where you have another person who vouches that they're going to contribute whatever the affordability gap is on top of whatever money you have in order to make your rent affordable and give you future ability. In reality, HRA never really enforces those third-party guarantor agreements, right? I mean, they're not legally recognizable. It's not like HRA or anybody can sue this third-party guarantor in court for failing to keep up with their promise. That's not really a thing. But they are available. You can also have more than one guarantor, but HRA has somewhat of a jaundiced view of guarantors in general, and having to come up with 2 or 3 third-party guarantors is probably not going to be great news with HRA because it makes the futurability in their minds anyway less likely because now you have to rely on 3 different people to give you some amount of money going forward. The other thing that's an absolute no is that the non-custodial parent can never be the guarantor. Just do not do it. Never, 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 ever. And that's because HRA will say, you have a non-custodial parent, well, they have to take care of their children, so they just have to pay the rent. So we're not only are we disregarding this one-shot deal, but we're going to report them to the Office of Child Support Enforcement to say clearly they have money, so somebody should be paying child support. So do that. And you can obtain a roommate, right? So there is a complicated math that can be involved in determining what futurability means. You could think of it in one of 2 different ways. So first, you can look at the amount of income coming in. HRA sort of looks at take-home income and not just the pure gross income, unless the gross income is the take-home income, right? Like you're cleaning houses and you get $300 a week, right? there's probably not going to be taxes taken out of that. Of course, at the end of the year, you have to report it and pay your taxes, but you have $300 in hand. So they will add it up for a month. And a month is 4.333 weeks. It's not 4 weeks because the average month is 4.333 weeks. So you'd have to take that amount and multiply it by 4.333 if it's a monthly amount. I mean, if it's a weekly payment, or 2.167 if it's a biweekly payment. That's what you would do for that. And so let's say your weekly income is $200, right? So that's $866.67 a month. HRA will throw away a third of that right there and say, a third of that income is just unavailable to you. And so they'll only let you have the 2/3 left in order to prove your rent. The better way really of doing it that is more effective is comparing what is left after you pay the rent to the amount that that household would get if they're getting cash public assistance. So the cash public assistance grant is made up of two sort of components. One is the shelter allowance, that is the terrible amount that goes directly to the landlord every month. And then the food and other grant is what advocates call the lump sum that shows up on your EBT card as cash available to you every month. And the food and other amount is on your screen, depends upon the household size. And if you can show that a household has more than the food and other grant left after paying their rent, then you can say, well, HRA, our client has $185 after paying rent. According to our state, $183.10 a month is enough for a human to live on in our city. So if it's good enough for HRA, it's got to be good enough for our client in this circumstance, right? And they will have to do that. They will pay attention to that, but usually they'll wait for you to raise it as something and not do it on their own. Otherwise, they may just look at it and say insufficient income. Someone asked if I can repeat again when to apply for a one-shot deal. Sure. So timing of when to apply for a one-shot deal involves a lot of different moving parts. But in particular, when you apply from the date you apply for it, you're going to have to show that our client has enough money to cover the rent for the month in which they are applying. That's part of a one-shot deal, is saying, I couldn't afford it, now I fell into arrears, but now I can. I have future affordability, in part as demonstrated by the amount of rent I have for this current month's rent. If I apply on November 28th for a one-shot deal, I have to prove that my client has November share. And the chances of HRA approving and cutting a check for that November one-shot deal within November are about 0%, right? So soon I'll be in December. And so now I'm going to have to show the client that they have to come up with December's rent. And you're probably going to have to come up with December's rent in the first week of December in order to get the one-shot deal ultimately approved, right? Because they're only going to pay the arrears and up until usually the month before you applied. And having to be on the hook for all those additional months can be a significant burden on clients, and of course may also be extremely difficult for the client to do, which will mean their one-shot deal is ultimately denied. So do think about when you are applying for a one-shot deal for clients. The same is also true of the example I gave with the federal stimulus payments, right? So the rule is now that those federal stimulus payments from CARES are exempt from counting as an available resource in the month it's received and then the 2 months after it's received. So if you apply for a one-shot deal within that time period, then it's totally fine. They can't count that as part of an available resource that they'd have to spend down. But if you're outside of that amount, HRA can and will require them to spend it. So an example of future affordability. We have James, we have somebody at my door, which is always an exciting thing for a webinar. And my tiny attack dog is barking at the door, which is also a real pleasure for you. So James, who is 52, earns $230 a week as a part-time messenger. He receives SNAP and Medicaid. His monthly rent for the room he rents is $800. Can he demonstrate future affordability with his income alone? So what do we need to do in order to prove this, right? We have to multiply the 230 by 4.33. So this person gets, it has to be 4.333. It's always times 4.333 for any monthly income, because that's the average number of weeks in a month. If you look at the whole year, HRA never lets you get away with a penny. So that's $996.59 a month. That's the amount that this messenger is getting in income. And the rent is $800. So if I look at that, $996 a month in income minus the rent is minus 800. That would give this person $196.59 a month, which, in reality is an unaffordable rent. But in this terrible world of public assistance and emergency assistance, I would argue that it's affordable, because if this person were on welfare, he would be getting $183.10 a month. And that's what HRA thinks that a human can live on for a month. And he's got more than that after he pays his rent. So I would say, without fear of retribution, that this rent is affordable. And I would argue that with HRA, and I would at least win on that. Does that make sense to people? I mean, not as a public policy. It's not livable at all. No, it's terrible. It's a grotesque. I mean, nobody can live on this amount of welfare, right? That's the real lie that people tell themselves, that this amount of money to live on a month is livable, because it's absolutely not. It's also why words like welfare fraud always make me crumble, because, what is welfare fraud? And I challenge anyone to live on $183 a month in New York City or otherwise. That's just not going to happen, right? But it's helpful when trying to figure out whether somebody is future affordability. So reason for arrears is, in all actuality, among the most important things that you have to prove to get a one-shot deal. And people really have no idea how critical it is in the analysis at the end. It also is a backdoor test of credibility, which HRA is always testing the credibility of. I don't know why, but not every kind of one-shot deal actually requires you to prove the arrears, but almost always it's going to require it. Do some questions. Should I be answering any questions here? Should I do this live? Or does Emily or somebody want to read them to me? I'm fine either way.
Hey, Jack, we thought we'd wait until the end, or do you want to do them now?
It doesn't matter to me either way.
Okay, let's wait until the end. Great.
So, when possible, frame your reason as unforeseeable and uncontrollable. Unforeseeable meaning I couldn't see it. Of course, the top example these days is COVID. I lost my job due to COVID, right? Most people didn't see this pandemic coming. Our president currently doesn't see it. So, it's unforeseeable. And the classic reason, again, is generally unemployment, illness, death, disaster, all the terrible things. And then you have to, if you can then explain that it was uncontrollable, meaning out of your control, that's what you have to do. So I would not disclose domestic violence to HRA as a general rule, unless you understand the ins and outs of HRA. Because when you disclose domestic violence to HRA, it has a very strange effect on HRA. All of a sudden, they're going to be extremely concerned about that person's safety and say, oh my God, they have to move. They have to move immediately. And you're like, no, no, really, they don't have to move. Um, they're safe here. They've done their own safety plan. I'm their case manager, whatever it is. This is the best plan for them. But it's a real uphill battle from them and HRA's reflexes to say move immediately, um, which sometimes is the right thing to do, right? But if you're doing that, you're not requesting a one-shot deal, and you certainly don't need HRA to be your um, interfere in your life. So you're going to also have to be prepared to prove the reason. So if you tell HRA that your child got sick last October and you were out of work, you better be prepared to have something showing that you were out of work and that your child was sick in October, right? Um, because HRA wants a piece of paper to prove everything, in part because they don't believe you, really, but in substantial part because they're trying to survive an audit from the state, and they need to have a piece of paper in their file to prove everything for when the state comes knocking on their door and makes them explain each and every grant. They want to see a piece of paper relating to that cause, right? So let's look at a reason here. So you're working with Karima, who is 25 and is raising her child. She has sufficient income to pay her, cover her rent, but she fell into arrears because she suddenly had to buy school supplies for her daughter. Is that unforeseeable and uncontrollable? It's not unforeseeable and uncontrollable. You know, the school supplies are going to happen. It sucks every year because they always want you to spend a just a treasure on school supplies that in many cases the school actually never uses, which is extra irritating, but that's a different discussion. So you can, in theory, plan for this. Of course, it's a farce if you're low income anyway, you're doing what you can to survive, but in theory, you have to do that. It's not unforeseeable. And there could be other reasons for these arrears, right? But simply saying that you had to buy school supplies, that's not it, right? So we can't use that reason with HRA. They're just not going to do it. You're going to have to prove something, right? That's right. You would have to prove something particular. Um, that would be better if you said that I was setting aside $150 and now I want but it ended up being $300 because I had to buy a computer. You know, I don't know if that wins, but I think it gets you much closer to a one-shot deal approval, saying, you know, we had to buy. I had unexpected computer costs because now we're all doing this remotely. I think that might work with them at this point, and it would be reasonable, yes. Um, uh, they they just want it to make sense, right? Um, So let's look at an example. Can you get a one-shot deal if you're in a program like congregate care? Usually not, but there may be other special grants available to help with certain costs, but a one-shot deal is it's not exactly fitting into that in particular. Um, so let's look at example number 2. You're working with Anna, who has a non-payment eviction case against her. Her rent is $1,350. Her arrears are a little over 6,000, and she tells you she lost her job 3 months ago, and she's just now getting her unemployment. Um, her mother will also contribute $300 a month towards her rent. Do we have enough information? And what proof would we need? Yes, you can get a one-shot deal for Con Ed. Unemployment letter, a bazillion percent, yes. Absolutely, we're gonna have to prove her unemployment, 1,000%. They won't believe you. And you can get your one-shot deal by printing it out. You are going to need a ridiculous amount of information from her mother. That's absolutely correct. Uh, it it doesn't have to be notarized. It just has to be a letter. But the mom is going to have to demonstrate how much income she has coming in, and they look at a third-party guarantor's amount of income in a much more restrictive way. You're generally not going to be successful saying, well, the third-party guarantor has $183.10 left a month. after paying this year, you're going to have to show they have substantial income above their rent and above whatever share they're going to pay for you. Those are all good ideas that people are sending to all panelists. Letter from mother, notarized letter, other bills, letter of agreement, all great. But critically here, let's look at how much she owes. She says she lost her job 3 months ago, and 1350 times 3 is not over $6,000, right? That's not going to prove it. She owes 4 or 5 months of rent. So if you tell HRA that you lost your job 3 months ago and that's why you fell into rent, HRA is going to say, great, love it. We're going to need proof of unemployment, etc. And so now you're 45 days into your one-shot deal application, and HRA suddenly says, well, you said it was you got into arrears because of unemployment, but your arrears started 5 months ago. And if you had just explained at the beginning a fuller story, right? If you'd said, you know, my work cut down my hours in the last couple of months. I knew something wasn't going right there, but it was the job I had. And then eventually they just let me go. I think they used COVID as an excuse to let me go, but they let me go. Now you can say, look, I was working 5 months ago, but maybe my hours reduced, or maybe I was always a little bit behind in rent because my daughter also has to take a special learning classes across town, and we take a cab twice a month, and it's $200 to get there every month, right? Those are reasons. Those are all very good reasons, but you didn't say that when you applied. So now you're sort of starting from behind, right? So you have to package it at the beginning, which is truthful and makes sense to HRA. And I see this kind of example all the time, right? Where advocates will come to me and say, oh, HRA is being a nightmare, and my client is sick and they're not paying it. And then I go through the file and I see what they said at the beginning, and you're like, okay, your story is inconsistent with HRA. HRA assumes inconsistency equals lie. So you then have to work extra hard to prove things that probably would have been proved if you just packaged it more accurately at the beginning, which isn't a fault of advocates, not a fault of clients. If you ask me why I fell into arrears, and I've been into arrears for 7 months, I'm not going to say, I remember, well, it was a Sunday morning and I suddenly realized I didn't have money, right? Like, that's not how it really happens. These are all mistakes of memory, and finances are much more complicated than all of this, but you have to be able to get to move your advocacy into the way HRA thinks about things. Yes, you can apply for a one-shot deal for HASA clients, which we'll talk about a little bit later. There's a question. So you also definitely have to have 1 month's rent, right? So you have to include the 1 month's rent for the month in which you're asking for the one-shot deal. And then you have to, as the one-shot deal goes through the very slow process, you will have, it may bleed into another month, and they will come up with, so if I applied October 28th and now it's November 2nd, I would have to have October's rent and I would have to have November's rent before HRA issued me a one-shot deal for any of the arrears. So people are obsessed at times with the amount of money that is owed, right? And that, that is the significant thing, right? But if I owe $20,000 in rent and my rent is $1,700 a month, that's a lot different than owing $20,000 and I have Section 8 and my share of rent is $400, right? And HRA looks at those two different things, right? So they're looking at dollar amounts, but they're also looking at how much time it has been since you haven't paid rent. Is jail or prison time a good reason missing rent? It is a good reason to explain why you didn't have rent in those months, but you will have to be prepared to show that it wasn't, you weren't generally perpetrating some sort of family violence, because HRA will often say, well, you created poverty by abusing your family and going to jail. We're not now going to report you with it. So it's a complicated answer to that person who asked. So in this example that I gave, right, 1350 is really 5 months of rent, but so look at the number of months of rent that are owed and packaging your request generally. And that's an important element. And the part of HRA that handles these requests, called the Rental Assistance Unit, except for HASA, HASA handles its own HASA part of this. You don't send one-shot deal requests for HASA recipients to RAU, only send them within HASA. But RAU will essentially automatically deny arrears over $10,000 and over $15,000 in Manhattan. And by deny it, I mean they'll return it to the client and say, arrears are too high, please lower arrears. As if you were like, oh, why didn't I think of lowering arrears? That makes total sense. I forgot that I had $8 billion. Why am I applying at all? But this means is that you're going to have to demonstrate to HRA that you've exhausted every other plan on earth to come up with any money, right? You've tried every charity and all the charities don't have money, or I have $900 from a charity and that's all I could handle. Thank you, Cheryl, for sharing that about congregate care clients. But you will in fact be faced with it. So if you owe $15,000 and it's in the Bronx, be prepared to say, this is 8 months worth of rent. Our client has gone to this agency on this date, this agency on this date, this agency on this date, and there's no more money to be had. And that can often overcome that element. So regulations are often much more restrictive than people understand, because one-shot deals are so commonly known, right? Like you just say, oh, go get your one shot. And everyone knows their friend Cookie who got a one shot for $25,000 that one time. So everyone's like, well, then I'll just, they pay whatever. I'll just go in and get it. But the reasons for getting them are quite restrictive. And often what people are requesting is a discretionary one-shot deal that is really called an exception to policy grant. But first, we're going to talk about 4 different types of one-shot deals before we move into an exception to policy grant, which is sort of what we're going to move into eventually. Can I show my abbreviations when you get the chance, please? Sure. So, apologies. I knew I would slip into code, and alas, I have. So I'll leave this up for a minute while I drink. Yes, you can download the slides. I think this one's probably the one people want more. Okay. All right. So applicant arrears or recipient arrears. So you can get a one-shot deal if you receive cash public assistance. It's a specific kind of one-shot deal available. So applicants for cash assistance who are eligible for cash assistance and recipients of cash public assistance can get a one-shot deal to cover their arrears. And the rules are listed here. So it has to be essential to stop the eviction, fine. No other shelter accommodations are available. So that is an extremely impossible burden to meet ultimately, which I'll talk about towards the end in some more detail about why that's harmful, but you usually don't have to send some major letter to them explaining how no other place on earth is available to them. You have to show future ability, and you can only get 6 months worth of arrears every 5 years. And it will usually be repayable or recoupable, meaning that they're going to have to pay it back to HRA, including having some of it deducted from their ongoing cash public assistance called a recoupment to pay them back. So that's for people who are applying for cash assistance and are eligible for it, or people who currently receive cash assistance. So how could you possibly show future ability for cash assistance when you're on cash for your rent when you're on cash assistance, right? Because the shelter allowance levels are so pitifully, awfully, terribly low. Well, most people in this category have a third party guarantor to make up that deficit, or they have a roommate, or they live in Section 8 or NYCHA, right? Or in supportive housing, the supportive housing that has the rent set at certain percentage of their income, or they just accept the shelter allowance as the income, or they're a HACA recipient, which has a higher payment threshold in general. But there are many people in this category, and it's supposed to be an easier procedure for people in this category, in large part because the one-shot deal application is mostly just asking your caseworker for a one-shot deal and then proving it with them. If you're just looking for a replacement of checks that have been stale or lost or stolen, you don't have to prove future ability. So if the landlord has been getting $400 a month in a shelter allowance for 12 months and they've just never cashed it, that's, a lost or stale check, and they have to reissue it. They're not supposed to ask you if you have future ability. You are entitled to get that shelter allowance. It's not your fault that your landlord doesn't bother to cash checks that are sent to them. And you can get that reissued without question, although they will question, they're not supposed to. Right? So that's one sort of a unique category, right? Because it's for people who are already receiving cash public assistance. Now we're going to talk about these other three kinds of grants, which are generally only available to people who don't have a cash assistance case open, but they might. So the first one we'll talk about is the Emergency Assistance to Families grant, an old one out there for those who have been by for a while. So it requires a crisis to meet an urgent need, which includes eviction, right? And the emergency has to be unforeseeable and out of the applicant's control. So this is one of those kinds that requires it. You'll note that this grant, you don't have to prove that for applicant arrears, you don't have to prove it's uncontrollable or unforeseeable. You don't have to do that. But for EAF, you have to prove that it is out of your, you do have to prove that it wasn't foreseeable and that it was out of your control. That's not true for if you owe Con Ed and your utility is going to shut off. You don't have to prove that the emergency was unforeseeable. They will just pay that. There's no strict limit as to the number of months that they can pay in the regulations, but HRA essentially will only pay up to 6 months worth of arrears under EAF. I don't really see them ever go above that amount. The key is you need to have a child in the household under the age of 21. EIF grants, you usually have to repay them, but only over the shelter allowance level. Okay, so this is a very, very key point. In these next few, we're going to be talking about repayment and recoupment in more details, and there'll be some examples at the end too. But repayment means that HRA will send you a monthly bill forever until you pay back the grant, and that they can send you to collections, and they absolutely do, and they can and absolutely will sue you in civil court for the amount of money that you owe in a one-shot deal if you don't pay it. A recoupable means that they will take it from your ongoing cash public assistance grant, that they will reduce your ongoing cash assistance grant by up to 10% each month until HRA recoups all the money it gave you. So for EAF, they're only allowed to repay or recoup that amount above the shelter allowance. So what does that mean? It doesn't matter if you are receiving cash or you're eligible to receive cash. If I'm a family of 3 people, my shelter allowance is $400. If I'm now getting a one-shot deal that includes an emergency assistance to families grant, I am only responsible for repaying the difference between the $400 in shelter allowance and the actual rent, which is $600, right? So if they pay 6 months of that, then I'm only responsible for the 600 times six. I'm not responsible for the 1,000 times six. And HOA doesn't always bother with that math, but I think it's an important thing to communicate to clients and looking at the repayment agreements that they issue, that they're not responsible for the um, amount. You would only get an EAF once every 5 years unless the commissioner approves an exception, and the commissioner ain't gonna approve an exception. Okay, so emergency assistance to adult, or EAA grant, is my personal favorite because it's the only grant that does not require repayment or recoupment. Even though it's called emergency assistance to adults, it's not actually exclusively for adults. The the essential requirement for EAA is that somebody in the household is getting SSI. Um, that's really the one. So there are non-rent emergencies that I've listed here, but again, we're talking really about rental assistance primarily here today. So the limitation is they're only going to pay 4 months prior to the month of application. So it doesn't pay any more than that, not once, not ever. It's not going to be available to you, just the 4 months. It does not require unforeseeable or uncontrollable circumstances, and it does not require future ability. So if your client really only owes 3 months rent and you apply and you're getting SSI, they should just be able to issue that as an EAA grant without getting into all the rigmarole about future ability. Was it an unforeseeable or uncontrollable event, right? But you can only get one EAA grant once every year or once every 12-month time period, unless the commissioner otherwise agrees, and the commissioner is never going to otherwise agree. So it's once every 12 months. The problem is that people's lives are complicated, and you almost never just owe 4 months worth of rent, right? But it's possible that it can happen. So the last kind of one-shot deal is an emergency safety net assistance grant, or as called affectionately and unaffectionately, an ESNAW grant. So the ESNAW grant is funded by the state and the city, and it follows many of the same rules as others, except there's sort of one important distinction, which is that if the household's below 125% of poverty or equal to 125% of poverty, they don't have to prove how they got into the arrears. However, if the income exceeds 125% of the federal poverty level, you have to prove that it was unforeseeable and uncontrollable, or that it was a fire, flood, or catastrophe. Now, the good news, if you can call anything in the business the good news, is that HRA is supposed to be, and to their credit has been, more generously interpreting what an ESNAW grant is and has waived this 125%. If you have lost your income in whole or in part due to COVID-19, then you should be eligible for an ESNAW grant without having to go through all the rigmarole of unforeseeable and uncontrollable. And that's helpful because, again, the repayment is only over the shelter allowance level for the household. But all the other things apply here. You have to prove future ability. You have to agree to a 12-month repayment plan, which I'll touch upon in a minute. And you will have to you have to participate with HRA to take a lien against any property that you own. So if you own a car, HRA will take a lien against your car for the amount of money that you get in your one-shot deal. And when or if you ever sell that car, that money off the top will go to HRA. If you live in a low-income co-op, like an HDFC co-op, and HRA will take a lien against your apartment for the amount of money you took in that one-shot deal. And if and when you sell that co-op, the money will go off the top to HRA. And you can only get 6 months of ESNAW arrears every 5 years, unless the commissioner grants discretion. And again, the commissioner never grants discretion. So I know there's a lot of questions. We will definitely cover them in the question and answer section. But I just sort of wanted to put, how do you figure out the 125% of federal poverty level? The federal government publishes the federal poverty levels every year, and they're also issued out by HRA. If you Google federal poverty levels 2020, it will show up. It may not give you 125%. You may have to do your own math, but in most cases, if you Google, you can find 125% listed. It's definitely listed by HRA in the various documents if you really want to Google them. So the ones we talked about so far are these specific kinds of grants, right? So there's the applicant arrears if you are eligible for cash assistance. There's emergency assistance to adults, which is for when there's SSI in the household, which is not repayable and not recoupable. There's EAF, emergency assistance to families, if there's somebody in the household under the age of 21. And there's emergency safety net assistance, or ESNAW, for people who can demonstrate certain other elements. And virtually all things should be ESNAWable due to COVID right now. But all of those are kinds of one-shot deals, and all of those have more generous repayment options than what I'm about to describe in exceptions to policy. So at some level, all of those other grants, you don't have to pay every dollar back. For EAA, you don't have to pay any of it back. For applicant arrears, emergency assistance to families, and ESNAW grants, you only have to repay the amount that is above the shelter allowance for your household size. However, exceptions to policy is where most people have to fall into, because at the end of the day, most grants can't be covered entirely by these other grants, right? They will fall into this category because you don't have, your income is too high, or no one has SSI, or you don't have a child under the age of 21, or whatever it was. So everything else that doesn't fit into this other thing is an exception to policy. And people always want to know the rules. There is no rule, right? The rule is that as an exception to policy, namely meaning regulations, statutes, agency documents, etc., they may, if they want to, give you money for an emergency such as avoiding eviction and entering shelter. So there is no absolute maximum amount they will pay. There is no absolute maximum amount of income that a household could have to be eligible for it. But there are general guidelines, right? So generally speaking, a household needs to be under 250% of the poverty level to be eligible for exception to policy, but they will go above that. And I've seen them go above it during COVID, right? So if you were making $85,000 in March and you lost your job, right? And now you're making 75,000, but you didn't have any income for 5 months, I think you could say, look, HRA, I fell into arrears because I lost my job. I had absolutely no income for all these months. And while I'm now on my feet, I really just don't have, the $12,000 in arrears I owe. Even though that household's over 250% of the poverty level, you may be able to explain that away. But again, it's general guidelines, because the whole point of exception to policy is that there's not a policy, right? And you virtually always will have to prove some compelling factor or factors. And it's the usual parade of terribles. Illness, death, disability, there are young infants in the household, there are many children in the household, you've lived there for more than 10 years, it's a rent stabilized apartment, and the rent is relatively low, whatever it is. You have to find compelling factors. And think of it as what policy makes it that HRA should pay the arrears for this person or this family or this apartment at this point in time. It's not anything other than that. It's about this family, this apartment right now. So, while these terrible things of illness and so forth can be, and it could be that you have been you're working and your grandmother and your sister live in your building, and they provided informal, low-cost childcare for years. And if you were evicted from this apartment, you couldn't work anymore because you'd have to pay for childcare, and that just would bankrupt you, right? So you can be creative in figuring out what this means. The bad thing about recoupments, about exceptions to policy, is that 100% of an exception to policy grant must be repaid, and they always require a lien against any property you own. So that's what makes them yucky. Right. I'll move on to a flexible one-shot deal. Right. So a flexible one-shot deal is a one-shot deal HRA doesn't want you to know about. It's sort of a liar's one-shot deal. And HRA can provide, and very rarely, and only under exceptional circumstances, a rent arrears grant when you just don't quite have future ability, but you think you will at some future date and time. Right? So, for example, I could say I was fired from my job, and I'm still fired, but I'm facing eviction right now. I'm going to be evicted. I have a job letter from my employer saying, starting December 15th, I will return to work and I will be paid my old rate of $500 a week. And then I'll be able to pay my rent. You may be able to convince HRA on the margins if you can explain all the sympathetic reasons why this family's apartment should be saved for them at this time, based on this trigger that's going to happen in the foreseeable future for which you have proof. But it's very, very limited in scope, and HRA hates doing it. Don't quote me. All right. So I'm going to move into examples now. Can you explain sanctions again now? I will go through these questions when I get to the end. So we will. All right. So now on to some examples. A good question for any of these: are people without citizenship or residency status eligible? Unfortunately, if you are not eligible for cash assistance due to immigration status, you are not eligible for a one-shot deal. That if you have one US citizen child in the household, though, that citizen child is eligible for a one-shot deal. Okay, so you just need one person in the household who is eligible due to immigration status, right? And HRA gets non-citizen eligibility rules wrong all the time. So it's true that all US citizens and all lawful permanent residents are eligible for cash public assistance in New York. 100% of them, okay? But there are many, many, many other non-citizens who are eligible for cash public assistance who don't have a green card and who are not US citizens. So I would not assume that just because somebody doesn't have a green card or isn't a citizen that they're ineligible for cash. And HRA will hound people and tell them quite convincingly that they're ineligible for benefits and be totally wrong. So make sure you obtain as much information as possible from your clients, and then you can refer somebody for help and assessment from a legal provider, including from Legal Services NYC. We just want to be extra careful not to add more fuel and panic and desperation to our non-citizen neighbors, families, friends, colleagues. Right now, it's just too much to bear, and unfortunately, the recent federal government has done a lot of harm to scare people into not applying for benefits when they may absolutely be eligible for it. All right, so let's talk about examples. So Ashanti and her 17-year-old daughter have lived in their Bronx apartment for 9 years. They've never been in shelter, and Ashanti isn't a veteran. She owes $12,000 in arrears. She received a one-shot deal about a year and a half ago. She last received cash assistance a little over 6 months ago. What do we do? So this is going to go a little beyond the scope of what most of you will do, but it will give you an idea of how a benefits advocate should look at the circumstance, right? So first I want to see if she's eligible for cash, because if she's eligible for cash assistance, then she may be eligible for one of the subsidies. If that's not possible, then I'll look to future ability, right? So I calculate how much income is coming into the household. You always multiply a weekly income by 4.3333. She's not eligible for cash. Because she's not eligible for cash, she can't get FEPS. And she's also not eligible for city FEPS, which has really stupid restrictive rules. So now I have to look at future affordability here, right? So her gross income after multiplying it out by 4.333 is 1841, and her rent is 1389, right? So she has $452 a month left over after she pays her rent, and the amount that you get in cash assistance for two people is $291.50. So she can prove future ability, right? Because her $452 a month that she has after paying her rent is luxurious compared to the amount of $291.50 that they would get if they were on welfare. So she can probably prove future ability. Now, a thing to know here is that HRA is going to say, well, if you're not getting food stamps, you're going to have to apply for food stamps, because they only think that you have future ability if you're getting all the benefits to which you're entitled. So they may say, you know what, you need to get on food stamps, and then we'll see that you have future ability. So do keep that in mind. Oh, is she eligible? Now we're going to look at the different kinds of one-shot deal grants, right? She's not eligible for emergency assistance to families because nobody's getting SSI in the household. That's a bummer because EAA is the only grant that is not repayable or not recoupable. She could get an EAF grant because there is somebody under 21. And if we can prove that it was unforeseeable and uncontrollable. But it looks like she got a grant 18 months ago, and you can only get an EAF once every 5 years. So chances are that she's already gotten it. But most of this grant in the end is going to be an exception to policy grant, but they'll probably give her part of an ESNAW grant if we can help package why she got into arrears and tie it to COVID. They may put some of it as ESNAW as a result of that. But in the end, most of this one-shot deal, if it's approved, it's going to be repayable, which is that. So Magdalena is 41, and she gets $866 a month as a part-time receptionist. She can't work more hours because she has sickle cell. Her 21-year-old daughter lives down the block, and she helps her when her mother is in severe pain. Her daughter's receiving cash and can't help with the rent. Magdalena has lived in her home for 25 years, and her rent is $903.23. What do we do? Again, the first thing I would do is figure out if she's eligible for cash. She's not eligible for cash because she earns too much money, which of course is terrible. So she's not eligible for FEPS, and she's not eligible for city FEPS either because she doesn't meet their stupid requirements. So now I need to figure out if she has future ability. And from what we know, there's no third-party guarantor available, right? Her daughter could move in with her. That may help increase it. But with the facts that we are presented here, she doesn't have future ability, right? She only has $67, $57 at the end of the month after paying. She's in the negative, actually, minus $57 a month. She doesn't have enough to cover her rent. So even though she is eligible for EAA if she got SSI, that's not going to pay all of her rent anyway because it's only 4 months, right? So we need to figure out some other plan here. It doesn't mean that they're going to be evicted, right? It just means that we have to figure out a way for this household to stay, and that's really going to require leaning on future ability. If there really is no future ability, then you're going to have to hang your hat on a flexible one-shot deal, which they almost never approve. And you're going to have to say, we're helping her apply for SSD. And according to Social Security Administration, if she were to apply for SSD, she would be getting $12.55 a month and she'd be able to pay her rent. You know, you have to try a Hail Mary pass at that point. But perhaps even more importantly, you're going to have to pound the pavement and see if there are any charities out there at all who will take mercy on this family at this time. All right. So, combination of grants, like I've been saying, in the end, your final one-shot deal is usually a combination of these different grants plus an exception to policy, right? So as a result, I would frame all requests for assistance using all of these factors, right? Unforeseeable and uncontrollable. There's no other housing available. You have future ability because of X. Here are all the terrible sympathetic factors in this household, right? It's a 3-generation household. The oldest member of this household is 82 and the youngest member is 1-year-old, right? Illness, disability, death, catastrophe, crime, COVID-19. If needed, go into the other factors. These other factors are useful with HRA because all of these are correlated to higher shelter and homelessness. So if you have more of these factors, the more likely HRA is going to think that this family will end up in shelter and thus cost them money. And do not mention domestic violence or family violence unless you're sure that you have some documentation or evidence, or you're willing to engage in the ongoing hideosity with HRA to prove that they're going to be just fine if they stay where they are, and that HRA should just pay the one-shot deal and quit trying to help. So people request fair hearings frequently when they're denied a one-shot deal, and I am not here to tell anyone not to file a fair hearing. A fair hearing is absolutely a right for so many things, and it preserves your rights to any kinds of things. So by all means, request the one-shot deal. But in most circumstances, you really can't win a fair hearing on a one-shot deal for different reasons, right? So you can't really win it in large part because you don't have that kind of time. When you request a fair hearing, it can take 60 to 90 days for it to get on the calendar. Then, so let's say you have your fair hearing 60 days from now, and then you have the fair hearing, and then they have 60 days to issue a fair hearing, and then the agency has 60 days to comply with the fair hearing, right? So we're talking about 180 days, right? So 180 days from now, your client would have been evicted for what, 5 months? So the timeline makes no sense. Also, most one-shot deals draw from the exception to policy, right? And those are discretionary. So HRA can deny it for any reason or no reason as long as it's not an illegal reason. So you can't get the judge to overrule or substitute its judgment for HRA's decision. It's not going to happen. Additionally, some of the one-shot deals, particularly applicant arrears, requires you to prove that there's no other shelter option available. And proving a negative is always a fool's errand, but it's particularly so at a fair hearing. You can't prove there's nothing left in the city that you can live in, right? How would you even go about proving that, right? I mean, it's commonly known among all of us that you're not going to be able to do that, but you have to prove it. And proving something is uncontrollable or unforeseeable is hard to do. So this isn't to say don't request fair hearings for your clients or don't recommend it, but don't expect that the fair hearing is going to resolve the issue, because in the end, it's going to be the client back and forth with HRA to make it, worthwhile. So how do you apply for a one-shot deal, right? So before the world changed, you would go to your public assistance center or to your HIV/AIDS Services Administration Center if you were a HOPS recipient. And you would go and you would say, I want a one-shot deal. You complete an application. And then you have all these stupid interviews where they ask you why you fell into arrears. Then you meet with a terrible part of HRA called BEV that accuses you of fraud. They interrogate you, or at least it feels like an interrogation for many hours. It's terrible. And then HRA Center sends the request downtown to a part of HRA called the Rental Assistance Unit, or RAU, and they ultimately make the decision on the one-shot deal. That's what was happening before the world changed, right? But now you can apply for a one-shot deal through Access HRA. And, HRA is so proud of themselves for doing this. There's definitely is a lot to celebrate and praise HRA for having created this online portal in order to apply for a one-shot deal, in addition to applying for cash public assistance online. But those of you doing supportive housing work know that there's a great disconnect between the ability and capacity and availability of doing this online, and the actual people who are able to do it, right? So HRA will cite to what a tremendous success Access HRA has been, and the thousands of applications that have come in. I'm sure that's true, but no one's counting the number of applications that people haven't been able to get through, because as I'm sure most people on here know, many clients, particularly those with impairments, have really relied on going physically to their welfare center over the years, right? They don't know how to operate technology due to language or other impairments. And they really just have to sit in front of a human to figure it out. Even one of the terrible humans at a welfare center, right? You just had to have that. And now that's taken from them, and it's become extremely difficult. But you can help walk your clients through how to apply for a one-shot deal online through this portal. And it's really very helpful. You can upload all of your documents into it, so you don't have to hand them over to somebody at the counter. You should be able to do 100% of your one-shot deal application virtually now. You should not need to go to any HRA center for any reason at all. Unfortunately, many clients still need to go because they just can't do it this way. But in theory, anyway, it can all be done online. Remember that a one-shot deal application is really an application for cash public assistance, but a single issuance of it. So I know somebody earlier talked about single issuance payments, and that's right. A one-shot deal is it's called SI, or single issuance, because you have to go through the whole process of applying for cash public assistance. It's the same application as cash public assistance, but in the end, it's just that single issuance payment and the case closes, right? So it is a very unnecessarily long process, because it's the same process that you have to go through to open cash public assistance case. It's just at the end, you don't get the benefit of ongoing cash assistance, you just get this. When you go through Access HRA, it's easier. You do not need an email in order to have an Access HRA account. You can just have it as Jack 1022 can be your name, right? So you don't have to have an email address, which is helpful. If you already have an open cash public assistance case, right, and you're applying for applicant or recipient arrears, it's even easier. You would just need to go into the Access HRA account or create an Access HRA account. And then when you're in it, you go through different tabs, the benefits tab, and then you click apply for special grants. And then there's an option within special grants for you to apply for a one-shot deal, which is a much smaller application. It's because it's not the whole cash public assistance application, because you already receive ongoing cash assistance. Otherwise, you should go through this whole rigmarole, right? If you don't have an open cash assistance case, you'll have to go through this. If not, you can use this faster method. So now you don't have to go in, but they still are going to call you and have that interview. And the client has to be prepared to explain why there are arrears, why it occurred. And again, if you can frame it as unforeseeable, uncontrollable, and related to COVID-19, great. And why you now have future ability, right? Practicing in a role play really is so helpful for clients. It is so nerve-wracking to go through this process. Whether you've done it 7 times or you've done it never, it's extremely stressful. not only is it a humbling process at best, it's also at a time where you need emergency help, right? So just have a tight 2 or 3 sentences that explain it. Offering too much information to HRA is rarely a good idea. You don't need to go back to your childhood. You don't need to go into great detail about why you lost your job or that your boss was a schmuck. You don't have no. You lost your job and it was related to COVID-19. They downsized immediately to 2 employees. I got the cut. Whatever it is, right? But boil it down, and they are always going to ask you why you fell into arrears or expect that you will provide that answer. And of course, they are going to go over with a ridiculous fine tooth comb your income. So this is what it looks like now in this online post. Um, it's not really post COVID, right? During the current state of affairs, right? Mid COVID, hopefully not mid. I'll withdraw that. So, you submit your application for a one-shot deal, hopefully through Access HRA. And then, even if you apply in person, or if you do it online, you just get a phone interview. They're not going to interview you there. If you do not have a phone that works, they can make an exception and have somebody sit down at one of the booths at the Open HRA Center and wait for a call. But generally speaking, almost everybody's going to have a phone interview. And if it's an emergency assistance, which would be if it's a one-shot deal, they're supposed to have a phone interview within 1 business day of your application. Now, HRA makes 3 attempts to call you, not 4, not 1, not 6 because you told them that the client has special impairments, not 5 because it's coming from a strange number, 3. And it's done through this phone queue. So it's not all that human of a process, right? If somebody picks up, it's transferred to somebody, but otherwise it's a pretty rote process. And these phone numbers come from a phone number they don't know, right? So I don't answer calls. I don't know who's on the other end. So imagine the rest of the world, right? So after those 3 attempts, if it's busy, if it's out of service, whatever, they're going to close your case and say you failed to interview and shut it down. So supportive housing providers in particular know how clients that have additional needs are not going to be the easiest people to complete a one-shot deal application for. So it's really obnoxious that the agencies are not making special efforts no matter what. However, if you notice within a few days of this happening, you could write somebody at HRA or at the rental assistance unit, I'll include it later on, say, could you please try to call this client? I spoke to this client. Their phone number is 347-111-2222. They're available on Tuesday from 2 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. If you do that, they will almost always call them back if you give them that specific date and time, and then they'll do it. Of course, the really unpleasant part about a one-shot deal is the pile of documents you have to give to prove it. Because again, a one-shot deal really is an application for cash public assistance. You have to approve all these stupid things in addition to approving all the things related to your eviction. Housing court papers, rent demand, rent invoice, your lease, how long you've been there, whatever it is, you have to include all of those things, and that's quite time consuming. The thing that's particularly scary about applying through Access HRA for a one-shot deal is you go through all the mishigas of the application, right? It's taken your client or you and your client an hour, right? You've answered all of their stupid questions. And then you get right to the end and they generate a repayment agreement in their system. And they do it automatically and it has very scary language. In essence, if you're applying for a one-shot deal for $12,000, at the end, you will have a repayment agreement that says you have to repay $12,000 to HRA at the following rate. And it'll say $1,000 a month because they just take the total amount and divide it by 12. That is a terrifying thing to see for anybody facing a one-shot deal, it's a terrifying thing for me to see. I don't have $1,000 a month to give to HRA or to anyone. So it's a very scary form to see, and it can be a reason where people are like, oh, I can't do this, and drop out. Now, that could be an overreaction, although I understand it, because they're just doing it the crudest possible way. They want you to sign this repayment agreement at the beginning, even though your repayment may actually be much less than that amount, because it could be that a part of it is ESNAW, EAA, EAF, applicant arrears, etc., right? Things that we talked about earlier. It's just that their computer's not sophisticated enough or doesn't have enough information and application in order to separate out that amount. So instead of having to create a new repayment agreement each time HRA recalculates the amount during its process, at which point they'd have to get a signature from that person, they just put it into Access HRA because they have state approval for a waiver of a signature if they just do it through Access HRA at the beginning. So while you can't assure clients that this is absolutely incorrect, in most cases, some part of this grant should not be fully repayable, and it really is just a crude calculation. But it's based there, and it is what it is. The other thing that's important to know is that you can absolutely call the division of HRA that handles repayments, which is called IREA, Investigation, Revenue, and Enforcement Administration. IREA administers a lot of the bad things that HRA does is done through IREA, and one of them is repayment. If you just ignore the monthly bill you get from IREA, eventually they will 100% sue you in court. However, if you call IREA and say, my repayment amount is $1,000, I really cannot afford $1,000. I have this much income, my rent is this much, can I pay you $25 a month? 9 times out of 10, IREA will say, yes, we will pay. Your repayment is $25 a month. Now, just send us $25 a month, then we will take no action. So ignoring it is the worst thing to do. And IREA, although unreasonable as a group, are fairly reasonable in determining a repayment amount. But some people walk around saying, oh, they'll just agree to $20. There is no rule that they will just agree to $20. It depends on how much income you have, and it's a back and forth with them. But they will lower it substantially from whatever the dollar amount is on your payment slip. So talked about this a little bit before. That ESNAW is being much more generously interpreted now, so that as long as you can explain that the arrears are due in part to COVID-19, chances are they will categorize up to 6 months worth of arrears as ESNA, which will mean that only the amount above the shelter allowance for that household side will be repayable, recoupable. And we talked about the CARES Act stimulus payment, provided that you received it now or in the next 2 months from now, any amount of that CARES Act stimulus payment in that period of time should be exempt from having to pay towards an emergency assistance grant. So I always recommend that people talk about repayment and recoupment with their client from the get-go, because just getting it in the mindset that it's a one-shot deal is just money that HRA will give you once a year is not true. You almost always have to repay it, or it will be recouped from your ongoing cash assistance case. When contacting RAU, always include the name of the landlord, the landlord's mailing address, the client's full name, and the client's PA number every single time. If you do that every single time, you will make them happier. So we sort of brainstormed, particularly with Rebecca, about what might be workable for supportive housing providers, right? So technically, supportive housing providers, the housing provider is the landlord, right? So you don't have any relationship between the client and HRA. That is their relationship, and you really can't interfere because technically you're in conflict, right? You, as working for the housing provider is saying you owe us money for rent, right? But I think we can all agree that housing providers, or supportive housing providers, are not typical landlords out there. In most cases, you're just trying to get the money that is owed. You're not really seeking to turn somebody out. So you could provide a letter in support of your client's application. I would write the letter to the rental assistance unit with your client and give a copy to the client. The client can upload it into Access HRA themselves if they so choose. Otherwise, you can fax it to RAU. I put the phone number here. It's 917-639-0342. That is the electronic fax that will go to the rental assistance unit. And it is always answered and is received, and it should reach the correct person. So even though I'm not entirely sure you can talk directly to people at RAU because you're sort of the landlord, I they can absolutely receive any letter of support. And as you well know, you are probably in a much better circumstance to gather documents than many clients are able to do so. So you may not get a response from RAU, but the client will get a response from RAU. So include a one-page advocacy letter. And yes, I mean one page. It's never 2 pages. It's always 1 page. Always use subheadings. I'll give an example in a second. And don't rely on HRA's generosity in determining what is EAA, what is EAF, or ESNAW. If you think that some of it's EAA, then you should say it. Say 4 months of this should be an EAA grant, and my client should not have to repay it or any part of it because they get SSI or whatever it is. And then send it as one attachment to HRA, especially if you're doing it by fax. If they have to open more than one document for you, they already hate you. If it's just one fax with all the things attached to it, they're more likely to deal with it. So here is an example. So you would write that I'm writing in support of my client. I'm including the stipulation from housing court or the rent demand explaining that you must pay X amount of money, you owe this much in rent, and it breaks it down. Some cases an invoice would work, I think, because for a one-shot deal, technically speaking, you just need the threat of eviction, which is usually a rent demand, which is the formal written notice. But, HRA is confused by what that means, so they may be tricked into thinking an invoice is good enough. And then you break it down into each different section. The subheadings are perhaps the most important part of the letter because HRA barely reads emails from commissioner banks, right? So imagine what they think of letters from supportive housing providers, right? So you want to make it very legible for them. And you're really following the things that we talked about earlier, right? You would have a section for why they have future ability, right? We have future ability in this household. I'm working with my client and we came up with this magical case plan. We're gonna once a month at the end of every month, I'm gonna have a meeting with my client set in the books and we're gonna say, how are you gonna pay next month's rent or whatever it is, right? And provide a distinct reason again in concert with your client so that because if your answer is different from the answer that the client gave, right? All of a sudden you're in that same set of circumstances. And if you don't understand all the quacking I've been doing, which is a real possibility because there's been a lot, but don't bother with this last section. But if you think you understand some of this, and I hope you do, definitely say, look, thank you for this one-shot deal, but just so you know, I know and our client knows that they get SSI and 4 months of this should not be repayable or recoupable, so don't get cute. Or whatever it is at the end, right? Because don't rely on HRA to do this on behalf of your client. They can and they usually do, but not always. So technically they have 30 or 45 days to process a one-shot deal, but they also are required to pay the money in time to abate the emergency. So if they are in housing court, they're supposed to pay it faster than 30 or 45 days. HASA briefly, it it follows mostly the same rules, except that it's a different process. So you don't go through RAU, you don't go through job centers, you go through a HASA center. And then it goes to HASA and it goes through a process called a case-by-case financial assessment, which is exceptionally an exception to policy rent arrears grant for HASA recipients. So it's follows mostly the same stuff. It's just through different humans. Well, I know it's unpleasant, and I know I've thrown a lot of things at you. And just when you think you've done it, HRA rolls out of bed and says, "You know what? Let's create city FEPs," and then everything changes again. But these one-shot deals have been around a long time, and in particular, these kinds of one-shot deals, EAA, EAF, ESNAW, have been around since, in some cases, Carter. So they're time-tested. So that's it. This is my contact information. You can email me. There are 1,370 of you, so I am outnumbered. So I hope to respond to you, but if I'm not, it's just because I missed it and I'm drowning.
Jack, thank you so much. That was so engaging and exhaustive, but also like very digestible. So thank you so much. I'm trying to kind of lump some of the questions into themes that I saw. So what would you say is the best one-shot deal program for someone who is on SSI or SSD?
If it's SSI, the best one-shot deal program is applying for a one-shot deal, right? If you have SSI, you should be eligible for an emergency assistance to adults, which is a kind of one-shot deal. And with that, 4 months of your arrears would be neither recoupable nor repayable. But HRA is supposed to make that determination automatically. If it's SSD and SSI, all you need is $1 of SSI to count for EAA. You don't need to have 100% SSI. As long as you're getting $1 of SSI, it should count. Otherwise, it would be the same other grants, exception to policy, EAF, ESNAW, would be the same.
Okay. And then someone asked, is HRA still requiring budgeting courses?
Yes, they certainly are. They really enjoy that condescending hug of, you guys just need a financial management course. That's why you fell into arrears. You know, I fell into arrears because I have $187 at the end of the month. I'm not spending it on, nightclubs and trips to Paris. I just don't have it. But absolutely, yes, they are requiring financial management at this time. Absolutely. And I've actually heard that HRA's own financial management course is pretty good. I've heard that from at least a dozen people who've been. So maybe that's positive. During COVID, they've been, I think something's available online. I think BronxWorks has something available remotely, which is very helpful. But it can be a helpful thing, yes. They may require it. I think they're less likely to require it because, you can't leave your home safely.
Right. There were a few questions about how to frame cases where there isn't like an obvious or classic reason for arrears. So like there just isn't an apparent reason, or someone asked someone who was exiting foster care, it looked like an ACS worker had usually paid their rent. How would you go about framing that?
Right. Well, part of our job is to mine for some reason. There's always some reason, right? It may just be poverty, right? And in the end, if you just say, I didn't pay it because of poverty, they're not really going to find that to be all that helpful, but it's true. If it has been that ACS has been paying it, and now you've aged out, that actually is a very good reason. They absolutely will say, oh, understood. They may, in that particular circumstance, require financial management, but that would be a perfectly fine reason. But I would challenge, I have never found, I don't know how many of these I've done over the years, thousands. There's always some reason. Now, you may not want to share that reason with HRA. I remember seeing one of the questions go by about substance abuse and drugs. That's a tricky thing to bring up with HRA. They will doubtlessly require you to comply with one of their treatment programs or prove that you're in one. But if you are in treatment and have been coping with it as best as you can, that can be a reason. But it's something you can only use once with HRA. So if I fall into arrears now and I say, I fell off the wagon and I was doing heavy drugs the past 6 months, but now I'm back on the wagon. And now it's a year from now and you happened again, they're going to say, sorry, we're not going to do that every year for you. You have to figure it out.
Got it. And then a couple questions were asking if a one-shot deal could be applied for kind of in an anticipatory manner, like for a new rental. No.
No, it requires a rent emergency.
Okay. Now I'm just going to go through the Q&A here and see what wasn't covered by those. A couple of questions about clients living in congregate care. I think you touched on this, but if you want to just go over it again.
I think Cheryl, mysterious Cheryl who's out there, answered this far better than I would have. It's through a whole different ball of hootenanny that is really not a one-shot deal or a rental assistance unit. It's done through the PHA, which is a separate thing. So it's not really within my, I don't do it with much frequency, but there is something that's similar to it that requires you to show why and how, but the process is much different. So if anything, I'd recommend Cheryl.
We'll find mysterious Cheryl out there. This question's on sanctions. HH has no sanctions during arrears period.
Yes, absolutely. So there are two main kinds of sanctions, right? One is a work sanction and one is a child support sanction. A work sanction is when you fail to cooperate with HRA's hideous, stupid, and condescending work activity requirements, right? So as a condition of receiving cash public assistance, people must prove that they are working, looking for work, taking courses to become employable, and or working on raising medical impairments so that they may be employed. You also would have to prove you're exempt from work if you think you're exempt from work. If you don't do those things, HRA will say, you're not cooperating with our process, so we're sanctioning your case. And a sanction means that your share of cash will no longer be paid. So if you're a household of two, they'll say half of it is gone. If you're a household of one and you're sanctioned, it means your case closes. During COVID, HRA has suspended the work rules. So you should not be getting a work sanction now. But many people are applying for arrears that are from January, right? So if you did have a sanction in January and February, HRA will say, okay, we're going to pay your one-shot deal, but you're going to have to come up with January and February because you were sanctioned during this month. And a sanction is supposed to punish you. That's the point of it, is you've been bad and now you're being punished. It's a terribly stupid policy that achieves virtually nothing. And it traps people in poverty. It's racist, condescending, and terrible, but it's the rule now. So they will look at that time period as we're not paying either all of it if you're a household of one or whatever portion you had. If you're a household of two, for example, they say, we're not going to punish your child, but we are going to punish you. The same is true for child support. You have to cooperate with HRA in pursuing child support against the non-custodial parent as a recipient of cash assistance. And if you didn't do that during any of the relevant period, you would have to, that part would be sanctioned and you'd have to come up with that share on your own, no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
If you're currently in sanction status, they won't even let you apply for a one-shot deal. You'll have to lift the sanction before you can do it.
Got it. There's been a couple of questions about like what one-shot deal funds can be used for. So I know you said it could be used for Con Ed. Someone asked about arrears for AC. I'm not sure if that means it was caused by paying for the AC or if going forward those funds could be used for AC. And then someone else asked about security deposits and broker's fees.
Sure. So, keeping in mind that our legislature doesn't do all that much to care for the neediest among us, most of the rules about what they will pay were written during a time period where there's progressive administrations and people cared. So that was decades ago at this point, and it hasn't been updated since then. So now clearly an internet is necessary for survival. And if you have children, it's necessary for learning, much less your sanity. But an internet's not an essential service. A cell phone is not an essential service because they all were written 1,000 years ago and no one cares, except for us. So they will pay for your Con Ed being shut off because that is an emergency. They will not pay your Optimum because your internet's about to go out. They will not pay your cell phone bill because your cell phone has gone out. If you have AC fees from NYCHA that you haven't paid, they will not pay those because that's not a utility emergency because your utilities aren't going to be shut off. You just will be hot and they don't care that you're hot. So no, it's very limited in that regard for utilities, and it never includes cable, and it never includes internet, and it never includes cell phone. What was the other part?
Broker's fees and security deposit.
Yes, so they will pay broker's fees, but it must be a licensed real estate broker, and they will only pay a maximum of 15%, and they have a special form and all this other Michigan. For a rent deposit through HRA, they will only give a landlord a voucher that they will pay HRAs on the hook in the end for 50% of the deposit if somebody moves out of the home with, damage. But it's only 50%. It's not negotiable. And landlords, it's changed 2 or 3 years ago. Who knows anymore? I don't even know what today is, right? But it changed a couple of years ago to be this voucher, and landlords hate it because they were so used to getting the money. So for 30 years, HRA was giving the money to landlords, and landlords love money. So now that it's this voucher, they really don't like it, but that's all that's available now.
Okay, a couple more questions come up. What would you suggest we do when a client has applied and can see that they were approved on Access HRA, but payments have not been received by the landlord?
That's a good question. I would fax RAU and say they're not getting paid, or refer them to a legal services provider. It used to be that we always wanted to pay this money over in court, right? Even if they didn't have an attorney, many supportive housing providers, home base, whatever, would get the checks, come to court and pay it over, right? Now that's not happening. And HRA's default is now to mail the checks directly to the landlord. And, if I always joke about this, if you mail me a check, I will cash it. I don't care who it's from. I will cash it quickly. For some reason, landlords just don't cash every check that they receive. I find it to be mysterious myself, but they don't. Sometimes it's because they don't receive it. Sometimes it's because the mailing address is wrong. And sometimes it's just for reasons that cannot be explained. And that's why you must include the landlord's address on every single fax or communication with HRA, because that will force them to check it with their system. And frequently there are errors with it. But essentially it involves having to reissue the checks and send them out again.
Got it. And then if a client is repeatedly requesting a one-shot deal, will their account be flagged as suspicious by HRA?
It won't be flagged as suspicious necessarily, but it becomes increasingly difficult to get one-shot deals. Not necessarily due to suspicion, but just due to that you're clearly not paying your rent. Why do we keep paying your rent? Because you haven't paid it. But it's not necessarily the number. If I got a one-shot deal 2 years ago and now I'm getting a one-shot deal now, and it's for 2 years worth of rent, our HOA is going to say you haven't paid any rent since your last one-shot deal. So you've never had future ability. We're not just your bank. You can't get a 0% interest loan from us every 2 years. Figure it out.
Could a client who is missing/lost cash public assistance payment get those payments resent through which specific one-shot deal application?
You can. The client can request it as part of a one-shot deal, but what HRA is supposed to do on their end is they're supposed to reissue any missing stale shelter checks as part of the one-shot deal and issue it to the landlord, but it should not count as repayable or recoupable because it's just a reissuance of money that should be sent. So it's generally sent to the landlord all at once just because that's how they do that process. But in actuality, it's coming from this other, it's really coming from the center and not from RAU downtown.
Mm-hmm. And then a couple questions about the furniture assistance grant. Can you speak to that?
Oh, the furniture assistance grant is another victim of neglect and treating recipients of public assistance or those in need as if they've done something wrong. It hasn't been increased in 100 billion years. The dollar amounts for the furniture grants are terrible. I think for a couch, it's like $113, it's some random amount, which at some point someone sat down and did a calculation about what a sofa reasonably costs. But that was 1971. And you can't get anything for $113 anymore. So the other thing to know about furniture allowances is that they do exist, but they're almost exclusively for people who've had a flood, disaster, catastrophe. So most times they're not available. Occasionally you can get some portion to establish a new home, which I've seen them do occasionally when people move from shelter. But what they're keen on is giving this voucher that you go to Goodwill and get used furniture up to certain dollar amounts, which is fine, but it's not the furniture allowance that you think of.
Mm-hmm. How about, would a client stating having to pay child support and that set him back in his rent? Is that a valid? Nope.
Whoopsies, no. Okay. I'm gonna help you.
We were trying to, this question comes from someone who says we were trying to get a reissuance of a one-shot deal check and they were giving us a hard time.
That sounds right. Their default is to give you a hard time. That's their resting state. That does not mean it's the final answer, but it certainly is their happy place. On their end, what they're trying to do is figure out if there's fraud, which I always think is kind of silly because if it hasn't been cashed, where's the fraud, right? Like it's just an uncashed check out in the world that they can cancel. So that's a little silly. But that's essentially what they're trying to figure out is if there's some fraud or collusion or some mysterious boogeyman hiding in the closet. It almost never is.
I think that, I mean, for all the really big...
Just warn them out.
That was really, really great. Thank you so much, Jack. One thing I do want to add is that the policy team at the network has developed a template for the letter of support from the provider.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so we can send that out to all the attendees afterwards, and we'll definitely post it on our website. We'll also post your slides and a recording of this session on our website